This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitzahon, and today I'm continuing with my Core Set 2021 Limited Review Week. Limited Review Week includes me talking about all the cards in the set individually, an archetype guide, and a top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format. I looked at all the white cards yesterday, and today I'll be looking at blue. A few disclaimers before we proceed. These ratings are of course based on my opinion before actually playing with the cards, so I will get some things wrong. Also, just to restate it, because it always comes up in the comments, this video is only about limited. That means draft and sealed. I'm not commenting here on constructed formats at all, not standard, modern, EDH, none of it, except maybe for the occasional aside. Finally, I use a letter grade system to sum up how I feel about particular cards, and if you aren't familiar with what those letter grades mean, you can find an explanation of the grades in the description below. Alright, let's get started with our first blue card. First up, it's Baron, Tellurian Archmage, who for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 2/2 legendary human wizard at rare. When he enters the battlefield, he may return up to 1 other target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand, and at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent was put in your hand from the battlefield this turn, draw a card. Baron is back for the first time since like Urza Saga, and he still likes bouncing stuff. Baron is basically a mana war with a lot of upside, and mana war is usually like a B- already. Adding to the board while subtracting from your opponents is quite powerful, and gives you some serious tempo. Baron, like Mana War, can also bounce your own stuff, which you want to do sometimes anyway, like to abuse an enter the battlefield ability or get rid of an aura on one of your creatures. But Baron also draws you a card each turn that you bounce something to your hand, giving you additional incentive to do that with Baron and other cards in this set. I think the whole package here is a really excellent card with a great floor and an impressive ceiling. I think that makes Baron a B, a card you'll first pick most of the time. Next up, it's Cancel, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a common instant that says counter target spell. Cancel is usually right on the cusp of being an okay playable and limited. 3 mana to counter something is a lot to leave up, and the big downside with counter spells, as opposed to real removal, is you have to have the mana up at the right time or you don't get to use it. These days, we expect to get some extra effect when paying 3 mana for a counter spell. I usually give Cancel a D+, and I think that's where I'm going this time too. Next up, it's Capture Sphere, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura with flash with enchant creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you tap enchanted creature, and enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. We've seen this a lot, and it's always a serviceable but not premium removal spell. It isn't terribly efficient, and it doesn't shut off static or activated abilities, and it also has the potential to be removed by things like Baron. It is enough to make most creatures not matter anymore, though, and having flash is some nice upside. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Discontinuity, which for 3 generic and 3 blue is a mythic rare instant, and it says, as long as it's your turn, this spell costs 2 generic and 2 blue less to cast, and it says, in the turn. 3 simple words, right? Except that there's a ton of reminder text, because they want to remind you what that means, because it's pretty complicated. It says, exile all spells and abilities from the stack, including this card. The player whose turn it is discards down to their maximum hand size. Damage wears off in this turn and until end of turn effects end. This is a wacky mythic, of which there are several in this set. Time Stop is a card we've seen before, and it was pretty alright and limited. You can use something like this a few different ways. The ideal way is to use it as sort of a reverse time walk, to use it on your opponent's turn to make them skip their whole turn, although they do get to untap no matter what. Sometimes waiting to cast it in response to them doing something is even better because it will just remove whatever it is from the stack, effectively countering it and ending their turn. You normally don't want to be using these on your own turn since you would like to have your whole turn, but this offers some extra incentive to do it, namely that it only costs 2 mana if you do it on your turn. So when do you do that? Well, it can effectively be a counterspell on your turn. A kind of narrow one, but the most ideal way to use it is probably in response to removal at the end of your turn, since the card will be effectively countered and it's the end of your turn anyway. Having to use this earlier in your turn can be a real pain, but sometimes it will also be worth doing. So this sort of has 2 modes basically. One where it effectively gives you an extra turn, and another where you can use it as a pseudo counterspell. How does all of that add up? I think relatively well. It is sort of situational to be sure, but it is effectively a split card, and even if both halves are somewhat narrow, you can always use the one that is most advantageous for you, making it a little bit less situational. Taking your opponent's turn is super powerful, and while the counterspell option is more situational and less powerful, it is nice to know you can use it that way if you have to. Overall, I think this deserves a B-. You'll take it with a first pick some of the time. Next up, it's Enticing Hold, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon enchantment with enchant creature, and it says you can't choose an untapped creature as the spell's target as you cast it. You control enchanted creature. This looks a lot like Mind Leash, a card that was great and limited, and that shouldn't really be a surprise. Mind control effects are very strong. This is because they are effectively removal spells that add to your board. Now, straight up mind control is like an A+ in limited, and this isn't quite that good. The fact it can only target tapped creatures is a bit of a letdown, since it means that your opponent will generally be getting one hit in with something before you can steal it, and if they have something great that they never have to attack with, it's going to be even more of a problem. Being narrow like that pushes this below the bomb range of many mind control effects, but even with that limitation, this effect is powerful enough that I want to first pick this most of the time when I see it. It's a great uncommon, I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Frantic Inventory, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant that says draw a card, then draw cards equal to the number of cards named Frantic Inventory in your graveyard. So, apparently we needed a new accumulated knowledge. I actually enjoy these collect-em-all type cards in Limited as they make for interesting decisions even later on in packs. Obviously, you don't want to play this if you only have 1, it is woefully inefficient, and even 2 isn't really where you should be playing it. I think you need to get at least 3 before you start playing it, and any more than that and it becomes increasingly impressive. It doesn't hurt that blue-green has payoff for drawing cards and blue-red has payoffs for spells too. Keep in mind, by the way, in Limited, you can play as many copies of something as you can get your hands on, so you can actually go higher than 4. That always seems to be something that surprises some people. So, how do we grade a weird card like this? Well, I'm going to say it's an F with 1 copy, a D with 2 copies, a C- with 3, and it probably caps out around a C+. So, let's say it's an F, but a build around C+. Next up, it's Frost Breath, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant that says tap up to 2 target creatures. Those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. These types of effects tend to be at their best in more aggressive decks. This is because making it so your opponent can't block for a couple of turns is huge, and it also makes it hard for your opponent to race you, because if you cast this on their turn, they're going to lose 2 rounds of blocking and 2 rounds of attacking. So this is the kind of card that can really end games, and that feels great, but the problem with it is how situational it is. Using this defensively is a possibility. That's not the ideal way to use it. You want to use it when you can really make it translate into a bunch of damage. But even having that option, this isn't a great card just because of how situational it is. I mean, if you're an aggressive blue deck, you probably play one of these relatively happily. But if you're in anything else, you probably cut it, and even in the aggressive blue deck, you probably don't want more than 1. It's just too situational, and all of that means I think this is about a C-. Next up, we have Ghostly Pilferer, who for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Spirit Rogue at rare. When it becomes untapped, you can pay 2 generic, and if you do, you draw a card. Whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, you draw a card, and you can discard a card to make it unblockable until end of turn. This is a great 2-drop. It has reasonable stats, and it can become unblockable, which means it's relevant all game long. Additionally, the ability to draw you cards when it untaps is nice too, and you can sort of combine the discard for unblockable effect with that effect to negate the card disadvantage. The Pilferer also drawing you cards when your opponent casts spells in fancy ways doesn't hurt, but it won't come up that much in Limited. Still, a 2-drop who can attack all game long and potentially net you cards is quite nice. I think you can first pick this 2-drop pretty easily, giving it a B. Next, it's Jeskai Elder, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/2 human monk at uncommon. It's got Prowess, which is back as a keyword, which, if you don't remember, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Whenever Jeskai Elder deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. In other words, you loot. This is a reprint from Khans of Tarkir, and it was fine there. A 2-mana 1/2 with Prowess isn't the most amazing. We've seen a few different 2-mana 1/3s with Prowess in the past, and they weren't great either, but the damage trigger here, letting you loot, is pretty nice. That said, a 1/2 can't really threaten a whole lot of creatures as an attacker, even with Prowess, and the Elder will rapidly become irrelevant on many board states because it just isn't big enough. It's pretty nice on turn 2, but after that, it isn't all that impressive. I think it's just a C. You'll play it, but you're kind of hoping for some better spell payoffs. Next up, it's Keen Glidemaster, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 human soldier at common, and you can pay 2 generic and a blue to give target creature flying until end of turn. This is a nice common 2-drop. A 2-mana 2/1 isn't stellar, but it's pretty good when it comes with some real upside, and the Glidemaster certainly does. Being able to give creatures flying, including himself, means that he's relevant all game long, and he's capable of sending your big creatures to the sky and enabling attacks you didn't have before. Sure, 3 mana for the ability is not a good deal, but it's a pretty nice mana sink. It gives you something to do with your mana if you're flooded out, and it will have a real impact. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Library Larsonist, who for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/2 Merfolk Rogue at common, and when it attacks, you draw a card. I want to like this card, I really do. It's cool having a version of this effect that draws you a card when you attack, instead of only on combat damage, but the stats here are bad, and most of the time, this will just be attacking into its own death, and not even trading for anything, at which point you basically paid 3 mana to draw a card in a really roundabout way, and that really isn't what you want to be doing. If you put +1/+1 counters on this, back it up with tricks, or put auras on it, it does get interesting, but I'm still not convinced. It also provides a card draw trigger for cards that care about that, but still, I don't think you play this most of the time. If only you could mutate a Heron onto this in this format, but anyway, giving this a D+. Next up, it's Lofty Denial, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 generic mana. If you control a creature with flying, counter that spell unless its controller pays 4 generic mana instead. This is an interesting flying payoff. Flying, by the way, is the blue-white archetype in this format. This is either a bad counterspell or a serviceable one. 2 mana to force spike something isn't what you want to be doing most of the time, even though you can sometimes get your opponent with it. It loses its effectiveness as the game goes on, eventually becoming a useless card. Even if you have a flyer in play, that's kind of true, but making them pay 4 is a big difference, and it means that your opponent will more frequently get their stuff countered with it. Overall, I don't love this card, and I don't think it's even an auto-include in a deck that has a lot of flyers. I'll give it a build-around grade, though. I think it's a D- in a deck that didn't get there on flyers, so basically, don't run it most of the time, and a C in a deck that did. Even in a Flyers deck, it won't be more powerful 100% of the time, and that really holds it back for me since the floor is so bad here. Next, it's Miscast, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon instant, and it says counter target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 3 generic mana. This is too narrow for limited. It is efficient, against opponents who have lots of instants and sorceries, it might be kind of okay, but most opponents just will not have enough instants and sorceries specifically for this to be worth running. It also gets weaker the longer the game goes on because your opponent has more mana, so most of the time it's an F. However, as I said, it is a decent sideboard card. If you're up against a blue-red spells deck, opponents who have like 10 plus spells, then it probably is worth siding in, at which point it's probably a C. Next up, it's Mistral Singer, who for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 Siren at common, and she has flying and prowess. This is a potent common. Windrake is a good place to start. 3 mana 2/2 flyers are always playable, and while they probably aren't quite straight up Cs anymore, more like C-minuses, that's still a great place to start when you have upside, and the Singer certainly does. It comes with prowess, which means it will frequently be attacking as a 3 mana 3/3 flyer, and sometimes growing at instant speed to mess up blocks or allow itself to block more effectively. I think the efficiency here is good enough that you can take Mistral Singer with the first pick in weaker packs. Prowess has just proven to be such a strong ability over the years, giving it a B-. Next, it's Opt, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant, and you scry 1 and draw a card. We've seen this a lot lately, and I usually give Opt like a C-. It's a card that helps you see more cards in your library, which is nice, but it doesn't really do much in most formats, making it an easy card to cut. However, this format has 2 things going on that benefit Opt. The blue-green deck is all about drawing 2 cards a turn, and the blue-red deck is a spells deck. Having 2 archetypes where it will bring you extra value is enough for me to push Opt all the way up to a solid C. Next up, it is Pursued Whale, who for 5 generic and 2 blue is an 8/8 whale at rare. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent creates a 1/1 red pirate creature token with this creature can't block, and creatures you control attack each combat if able, and spells your opponent casts that target Pursued Whale cost 3 more to cast. This is a pretty cool design that references Moby Dick, which seems kind of random in a core set, but there you have it. So a 7 mana 8/8 is probably just a C. It is fairly efficient, but it also costs 7, so it isn't exactly something that will be easy to cast. But this card has a lot more than that going on. First, giving your opponent the 1/1 is pretty nice. It has a little tiny bit of upside for your opponent after all. You are giving them an extra body, but it also has a significant downside of making all of your opponent's creatures attack right into his 8/8 body and whatever else you have on the board. There will certainly be times where your opponent would have been attacking anyway, and that's gonna suck, but a decent amount of the time, this whale will have definitely changed their plan about attacking, but they won't get to change their plan in the end. They'll attack right into your board, at which point the game might pretty much be over depending on what else you have in play. The whale also is hard to kill with removal spells, and that's nice because if you pay 7 mana for something, you don't want your opponent to be able to take it down for 2 or 3 mana. Adding 3 to the cost of removal spells is no joke, and it means that even if things go badly and the whale is killed right away, you aren't taking a huge tempo hit because it is likely your opponent is paying at least 5 mana to kill it, and usually more. And what's more is, they still have the pirate in play, and if the rest of your board is still formidable, that pirate will still cause them problems. The whale won't be ideal in all situations, but most of the time it will really help you out. I don't think it's a bomb, but I think it's a B, something you first pick most of the time. Next up, we have Reign of Revelation, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says draw 3 cards and discard a card. This was in Modern Horizons, and it was pretty good there. 4 mana to draw 3 and discard 1 is a great rate, especially at instant speed. It can help you trigger prowess on your creatures, or it can help you activate effects that give you bonuses for drawing extra cards, in addition to the fact that it lets you just dig pretty deep into your deck. Blue decks will pretty much always want 1 copy of this, and I think the first copy is actually something to go after pretty aggressively, I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Read the Tides, which for 5 generic and a blue is a common sorcery, and you have 2 options here. One is draw 3 cards, and the other is return up to 2 target creatures to their owner's hands. I like the design here. I always like modality and limited. It isn't terribly efficient at either thing that it does, but the flexibility matters. Sometimes bouncing 2 creatures is what you need to find an opening to win the game, and other times you may have stabilized the board but need a little something extra to get over the top, and drawing 3 cards will get you there. Read the Tide seems like a solid one of in many blue decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Rewind, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon instant. It says counter target spell, untap up to 4 lands. I think this reprint will get a lot of people excited, but I'll say up front that it probably won't be very good in limited. 4 mana for a counterspell is a ton, and while this is free, in a sense, that fact won't matter in the vast majority of limited games. You just won't have another instant or activated ability to spend that untapped mana on most of the time. So you're just looking at what is basically a 4 mana hard counter, and that's something that you don't want to play in limited. That would be an F if that's all it was. Your opponent playing around it is pretty devastating, and it is a lot harder to do well tempo-wise with a 4 mana counter. I can see decks coming together sometimes that are loaded up with instants and or activated abilities, in which case it becomes a little better, but I think you steer clear of Rewind most of the time. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Riddle For, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment, and it says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you may have Riddle For become a 3/3 Sphinx creature with flying in addition to its other types until end of turn, and it has an activated ability. You can pay 2 generic and a blue to scry 1. This is a reprint, and I kind of feel like it underperformed last time we saw it. The fail case here is not good. An enchantment that lets you pay 3 mana to scry 1 is not worth playing. The question becomes, how many times does this have to become a Sphinx to be worthwhile? And I feel like the answer is at least twice, and that is perfectly doable within a spells deck, but this card really isn't going to be the kind of payoff that takes over games for you most of the time. It's just a solid payoff you'll include in your deck. I don't want to go above a C here. Next up, it's Roaming Ghostlight, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/2 spirit at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you return up to 1 target non-spirit creature to its owner's hand. As many of you know, this is my kind of card. I love Mana War, and they even made this spirit look kind of like a jellyfish. At least, maybe that's just what I want to see. But anyway, a 5 mana 3/2 flyer that bounces a non-spirit is a very good common. Adding an evasive creature to the board who subtracts from your opponent's board is a very real thing. You can even use it to bounce your own stuff if you want to. Sometimes there is value in doing so. There are not a whole lot of spirits in this set. There are a few, so that downside won't usually come up. This is probably Blue's best common, and it is definitely one I'll be taking early. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Rookie Mistake, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant, and it says until end of turn, target creature gets +0/+2, and another target creature gets -2/-0. I don't think I'm going to be playing this. Good combat tricks generally help your creature win combat, and this just doesn't do something that will make that happen very often. Sure, your creature might survive, but winning combat is when you help a creature who would have lost in a fight win a fight. That's not what you have here. This does get a little bit of a boost because prowess and stuff, and I do think that keeps it from being an F, but I'm going with a D here. Next up, it's Rousing Reed, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common aura with enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards and discard a card. An enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying. As you probably know, I'm not usually a fan of auras that don't give you some sort of value to offset their risks, namely the risk of getting 2 for 1. An aura has to either give a significant bonus or offset that risk with some additional value to overcome being a card I'm not interested in playing. Rousing Reed does enough for me to want to play it. It nets you a card when it comes down, even giving you some card selection, and the bonus it gives is no joke either. +1/+1 in flying is the type of bonus that can dramatically alter a board state. Now, you do still need to be wary of casting this when your opponent has mana up and cards available, because if they kill the target, you still get 2 for 1. But as long as you're careful, you're usually going to be okay with this. It will be particularly nasty on a certain large creature with hexproof that we're about to see. It also gives you some extra synergy in the blue-green card draw deck. Anyway, I'm giving this a C+. I think blue decks will play the first copy of this every time. Next up, it's Sanctum of Calm Waters, which for 3 generic and a blue is a legendary enchantment shrine at uncommon. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may draw X cards, where X is the number of shrines you control. If you do, discard a card. So, as I mentioned in the video on white, there is probably going to be a legit shrine deck in this limited format. There certainly was in Kamigawa, the last time we saw shrines. If you want to hear more about how that deck will work in depth, I will talk about it in my archetype guide coming later this week, and I talked a little more about it in the video on white. But for now, let's look at Sanctum of Calm Waters on its own. It's 4 mana for an enchantment that lets you loot every turn. It's not a great deal. Looting is nice and all, but the investment here is big and has no real or immediate impact on the board. That said, this format does have a card draw deck, the blue-green one, and a graveyard deck, the blue-black one, and I think those facts mean the Shrine is actually kind of okay to run in those types of decks, even if it is on its own. I think it's probably a C- there. If you're in the Shrine deck, it starts netting you legit card advantage when you get your second Shrine in play, and it sort of snowballs. It'll help you find your other Shrines, get them in play, and win with all your Shrine abilities. It's probably a B- if you can get it for the Shrine deck. Next, it's See the Truth, which for 1 generic and a blue is a rare sorcery. It says look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. If this spell was cast from anywhere other than your hand, put each of those cards into your hand instead. So at worst, this is a sorcery speed Anticipate, which isn't terrible. Anticipate's usually a C-. Generally, it's something that can make the cut as a 23rd or 24th card in your deck, but not something you really try to play or anything. As a sorcery, this is worse, so it's probably more like a D+. In Limited, you're just not going to be able to make it, so this lets you draw all 3 cards very often, if at all, so I don't really want to take that into account with my grade, so let's just give it the D+. Next up, it's Shackle Geist, which for 1 generic and a blue is a rare spirit. It's a 2/2 with flying. It can block only creatures with flying, and you can tap 2 untapped spirits you control to tap target creature you don't control. So a 2 mana 2/2 with flying that can only block flyers is probably a C+, maybe a B- in a super aggressive format. The additional upside here is kind of hard to get going. Yes, Shackles counts himself as one of the spirits, so if you just have 3 to 4 other spirits in your deck, you'll make it work some of the time, and when you can, it'll be really good, but this set doesn't have a whole lot of spirits, so I don't think you'll actually be able to pull it off with consistency. There's 1 at common and 1 at uncommon, in addition to Shackle Geist. This is actually the second core set in recent memory to have a spirit payoff, when the set basically has no other spirits, which is kind of weird. We had the Spirit Lord recently too. Anyway, Shackle Geist is probably a C+. If you do manage to get a few spirits, you'll probably feel better than that, but don't count on it. Next up, it's Shipwrecked Dowser, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 Merfolk Wizard at uncommon. It's got prowess, and when it enters the battlefield, you return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. I like this a lot. A 5-mana 3/3 that returns an instant or sorcery to your hand is already a pretty good card. It can help you get back a powerful removal spell while also having a large enough body to trade with something, and that's a 2-for-1. Adding prowess to the mix makes it even more appealing since it can become a 4/4 pretty easily, potentially at instant speed. Now, there is a downside here. If your deck doesn't have a decent number of spells, and you're just playing this as a 5-mana 3/3 with prowess, that's not going to feel too good. However, I don't think it is a stretch to say most decks will have 4 or 5 instants or sorceries, and if that's the case, you're looking at a pretty good card. It is a bit awkward that you can trigger prowess with any non-creature spell, and it can only return instants or sorceries, so keep that in mind. But yeah, I think this is the lower range of first pickable, giving it a B-. Next up, we have Spined Megalodon, who for 5 generic and 2 blue is a common shark. It's a 5/7, it's got hexproof, and when it attacks, you scry 1. Big hexproof guys like these can usually find a place in Limited. They're at their best in more controlling decks as they provide a large blocker who your opponent just can't interact with. Hexproof creatures also tend to be good places to put auras, since getting 2-for-1 when you put it on a hexproof creature is incredibly unlikely. It is a nice bit of additional value that this scries when you attack with it too. Overall, though, it is going to be only a handful of decks that want to play the Megalodon, and even when you are in one of those decks, it won't normally be something that's highly sought after, giving this a C-. Next up, it's Stormwing Entity, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 elemental at rare. It costs 2 generic and a blue less to cast if you cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn. It's got flying, it has prowess, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 2. This is really nice. I would definitely sign up for a 5-mana 3/3 that had scry 2 in most decks anyway, but this has a whole bunch of additional text. Prowess means it will often be larger and will really be a nuisance in combat for your opponent, and the fact that it can reduce its cost is pretty crazy too. If you have enough instants and sorceries around, double spelling with this won't be a crazy thing to do at all. It'll be pretty commonplace, provided you have stuff that costs between 1 and 3 anyway. And if you're casting this for 3 mana, you're getting an insane deal. So, this gives you a sizable and efficient body in the sky, in addition to smoothing out your draws, and that is a pretty great card for Limited. I do think it's not quite a bomb. It isn't utterly game-altering, just incredibly efficient. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Sublime Epiphany, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant, and it says choose 1 or more, and your options are counter target spell, counter target activated or triggered ability, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, and target player draws a card. This is really strong. Even with the bottom 3 options, returning a non-land permanent, creating a token copy of a creature you control, and drawing a card, you're looking at a super powerful card in Limited that will net you a 2-for-1 at least, and allow you to really disrupt your opponent. You might bounce their best creature and create a token copy to block one of their other creatures, for example. Then you add the counter magic aspect of the card into the mix, and it gets even sillier. If you actually counter a spell with this and do all the other stuff, you're going to be getting at least a 3-for-1. Now, it is going to be tempting to be greedy with this and hold on to it until you can counter something, but it will often be optimal to just go for it when you have the bottom 3 options, so be ready to be flexible with this. Overall, I think this spell has such a massive impact on the game that I'm willing to consider it a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. I can't imagine many pack 1 pick 1 scenarios where I don't take this. Next, it's Teferi, Master of Time, who for 2 generic and 2 blue is a legendary Planeswalker Teferi at Mythic Rare. He starts with 3 loyalty. He has a static ability that says you may activate loyalty abilities of Teferi, Master of Time on any player's turn. Anytime you can cast an instant. He has a -3 that says target creature you don't control phases out. Yeah, they brought back an ancient mechanic. It says treat it and anything attached to it as though they don't exist until its controller's next turn. This means it doesn't affect enter the battlefield or leave the battlefield abilities. It's there, but it can't do anything. And his ultimate takes 10 loyalty and it says take 2 extra turns after this one. Teferi brings a very interesting static ability to the table. Being able to use loyalty abilities at instant speed is pretty crazy, and it means you can use them on your turn and on your opponent's turn. His abilities are pretty great too. Looting twice every turn is no joke, and making an opposing creature phase out can certainly protect him to some degree, and then obviously enough his ultimate is crazy and will probably win you the game on the spot. I think frequently you'll play Teferi, loot, then use his phase out ability on your opponent's turn to keep him alive for another couple turns. This will usually be enough to keep him around enough to help you loot 3 times, plus he absorbs some damage, and that's without him having a ton of creatures to protect him anyway. Teferi helps you rip through your deck, messes with your opponent's board, and can end the game with his ultimate. But I don't think he is a bomb. Lacking a true way to protect himself and true card advantage holds him back. He's merely a good card, and one you'll take with early picks over most cards in the set, but I do think he's held to a B+. Next up, it's Teferi's Ageless Insight, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare legendary enchantment. And it says if you would draw a card except the first one you draw on each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead. This is interesting. It seems like a win more card, and it doesn't directly impact the board in any real way, and that does send up a red flag for me. Now, there is a decent amount of looting and card draw in this set, and the Insight is definitely a good payoff for blue-red or blue-green decks that are going to be drawing extra cards, and there are some other very real payoffs for that too, including another card with Teferi in the name we'll see momentarily. But even with that as a supported archetype, it is far from a foregone conclusion that Teferi's Ageless Insight will be worth running in all of your blue decks, or even all of your blue-green decks. That said, if you can turn this into the engine that it has the potential to be, it is going to feel awesome. It probably needs to net you 3 cards before you feel great about the situation. So I think this needs a build-around grade. I'm going to say it's a D in an average blue deck, but probably a B, maybe even a B+ in a deck that gets there on triggering it. This could mean it is worth taking pretty early, since it has a very high ceiling. Next up, it's Teferi's Protege, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 2/3 human wizard at common, and you can pay 1 generic and a blue, and tap it to loot. Just like the Planeswalker, Teferi's Protege can loot. As we've already discussed, looting is great because it helps you get through your library and gives you nice card selection. This looter also comes with reasonable stats for the investment as a 2/3. It is somewhat limited as a looter since it asks for 2 mana every time you do it, but that's okay. It's a good place to be spending your mana as the game goes long, and it will definitely have a positive impact on the outcome of long games. This is a solid blue common, I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Teferi's Tutelage, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you'll draw a card and then discard a card, and whenever you draw a card, target opponent mills 2 cards. This is another Teferi card that loots. Tutelage is interesting here, and its name directly references Sphinx's Tutelage, an enchantment from the past that milled opponents when you drew cards. The Tutelage came with a repeatable loot effect, and it could mill more than 2 cards at a time, so it is probably the better card and not a perfect comparison, but it is worth remembering that mill decks were very real with Sphinx's Tutelage in Limited, and with blue-red and blue-green both being capable of drawing extra cards, Tutelage might also be making mill decks very real in this format, especially if combined with something silly like Teferi's Ageless Insight. That said, one does have to acknowledge that there is significant downside to milling. You can enable graveyard synergies, and it doesn't impact the game in any meaningful way until you get to the point where your opponent is out of cards and you win, so devoting a lot of resources to this sort of thing can sometimes be a bad plan. That said, I'm reasonably confident that Teferi's Tutelage mill decks will be a real thing in this format, especially if you can get 2 of them, so I'm cautiously optimistic here. For now, I'm going to say it's a C+. I could see it going higher as a build-around, at least potentially, but it's also the kind of card that could just be horrible if the mill support isn't there. Next up, it's Tide Skimmer, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/3 uncommon Drake with flying, and whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures with flying, you draw a card. I like this card. If you know me, you know I love making Skies decks and I love drawing cards, and we have both in one card here. A 4-mana 2/3 flyer is generally not worth playing unless you're desperate, probably something like a D+. But luckily, this brings a pretty sweet ability to the table that can really turn into a card drawing engine. Sure, you have to have other flyers around, but even if you have like 4 flyers in your deck, you'll be playing Tide Skimmer. If you have 0 other flyers, you're not going to want to do it. It gets that D grade, but that would be pretty hard to make happen in blue in this set. Obviously, this pairs the best with white, because those are the 2 colors with the most flying and with all the flying payoffs, and sometimes this will really take over games in a deck with tons of flyers. Overall, I think this setup means that you don't want to take this early in the draft, but if by pack 3 you see this and have like 7 or more flyers in your deck, you should be valuing it pretty highly. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Tellurian Kraken, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 4/6 Kraken at uncommon, and whenever you draw a card you may pay 1. When you do, you may tap or untap target creature. This guy is a bit clunky. A 6 mana 4/6 is not so good, but his ability is a nice thing to have around. At worst, you can do it once on your turn to get a blocker out of the way and maybe enable some nice attacks. If you have some ways to draw cards at instant speed, and you probably will, this will be even better because it will let you tap down things on your opponent's turn, which will also prevent a creature from attacking. The 1 generic mana is a very reasonable cost for this nice effect. All that said, the mediocre stats do definitely hold this card back, and I don't think I'm anywhere close to taking it early. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Tome Anima. 3 generic and a blue for a 3/3 spirit. Okay, so there's 2 uncommon spirits. It's a common, and it can't be blocked as long as you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn. So this is one of those payoffs for drawing extra cards, and it is a decent one. An unblockable 3/3 can certainly represent some serious inevitability, though making sure you trigger this every turn is not a foregone conclusion. This doesn't seem like the premier payoff for the blue-green draw cards deck, but it is worth noting that it will probably also work well in blue-red, which will also draw extra cards. I think this is solid, but not much more than that, giving it a C. Next up, we have Unsubstantiate, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant, and it says return target spell or creature to its owner's hand. I liked this last time we saw it, and I'm sure I'll like it here. 2 mana to bounce a creature at instant speed alone is like a C, and this comes with the added upside of being able to target spells that are on the stack. This effectively allows you to counter things, though if your opponent has the mana to just play it again, and they will sometimes, it's not going to be worth it. You do go down a card for tempo with a card like this, but that is often worth it. I think it's a C+. I don't see a blue deck ever cutting the first copy. Next up, it's Vidalia Archanis, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 Merfolk Wizard at common. You can tap it for colorless mana, and you can spend that mana only to cast an instant or sorcery spell. This is a spell payoff we've seen before, and it's a solid one. Getting to play sorceries and instants a little bit earlier is nice upside, and it comes on a semi-reasonable 2 mana 1/3 body. That said, you probably don't play this at all if you're looking at a deck with fewer than 5 instants and sorceries, unless you're pretty desperate for a 2-drop. So I think I'll say this is a D in a typical blue deck, and a C in one that gets there on spells. Next up, it's Waker of Waves, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a 7/7 whale at uncommon, and it says creatures your opponents control get -1/-0, and you can also pay 1 generic and a blue and discard Waker of Waves while it's in your hand, and if you do, you look at the top 2 cards of your library, you put one of them into your hand, the other into your graveyard. I like this guy. I'm always a fan of big old creatures who have cycling, and this is better than that, since the ability gives you a little bit of card selection regarding what you draw. Additionally, we've seen the -1/-0 effect appear a few times in Limited, and the times we've seen it, it's been pretty impressive. So what you have here is a big expensive creature you can throw away in the early game, and in the later game, you have a huge creature who will have a considerable effect on the board, in addition to the size he brings to the table. Keep in mind too, the blue-black deck is all about the graveyard, and it has 2 cards, one at common and one at uncommon, that can reanimate creatures, so this can feel a lot like cycling a big worm in our last set, giving it some additional upside. I think all of that makes this first pickable. I'm giving it a B-. Do keep in mind, by the way, somewhat annoyingly, that the effect here is not technically drawing a card, so it won't trigger anything like that, because you just put the card into your hand. You don't draw it technically. Wall of Runes is next. It's 1 blue mana for a 0/4 wall at common. It's got Defender. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 1. This is an alright defensive creature who gives you some card selection. It slows down decks early who are trying to do a bunch of damage, but it does become pretty irrelevant late, though at least the scry is kind of relevant all game long. I think you cut these more than you play them, though. I'm giving it a D+. Our last blue card is Wishcoin Crab. He's back. 3 generic and a blue for a 2/5 crab at common. This crab seriously overperformed the last time we saw it. Its stats lined up perfectly so that it was a great defensive creature who represented a real problem for aggressive decks. The 2 power meant it could block and kill a lot of things and still survive combat. That said, it isn't like it was incredible. I just gave it a D in the set review, and it was more like a C-. I'll give it the benefit of the doubt and give it a C- this time too. Well, that does it for all the blue cards in Core Set 2021. If you disagree with any of my evaluations, let me know in the comments. Discussion about these cards can only help us all be better at Magic. Tomorrow I'll be back to look at all the black cards in the set. By the way, my videos are sponsored by Card Kingdom, and you can pre-order all the cards you saw in this video, all the Core Set 2021 there is now, if you follow my referral link in the description, so check that out. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you see the rest of the set review and a bunch more limited content, don't forget to subscribe. And if you need to see the other limited review videos, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.